The stranger arrived just before noon, when every table inside the little frontier café was filled with ranchers, merchants, travelers, and families escaping the dust of the road. No one paid much attention as he stepped through the swinging doors, removed his weathered hat, and quietly looked around the room. He was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, with a face marked by years of hard travel rather than easy living. His revolver remained holstered, untouched, and although his clothes were faded from endless miles in the saddle, every stitch had been carefully mended. This was a man who respected what little he owned. Instead of choosing a corner where strangers usually sat, he picked the table in the center of the café. From there he could see every face, every doorway, and every movement. It wasn't caution born from fear. It was the habit of someone who had spent 20 years searching for something he refused to give up on. The young waitress crossed the room carrying a coffee pot. She wore a royal blue prairie dress buttoned neatly to the collar and a cream apron tied tightly around her waist. Loose curls had escaped the ribbon holding her hair, but despite the long morning of serving customers, there wasn't a trace of carelessness in the way she carried herself. People respected her because she treated every customer the same, whether they could afford a full meal or only a cup of coffee. "What can I get you?" she asked politely. The stranger glanced at the menu only long enough to smile. "What brings people back here?" She looked surprised by the question. "The cornbread." "Then bring me the cornbread. With the beef stew? If that's how everyone eats it." She nodded once before disappearing through the kitchen doors. The stranger leaned back and quietly watched the room. A pair of ranch hands argued over horses. An elderly widow carefully folded half her bread into a cloth napkin for later. A young boy laughed every time his father pretended to steal potatoes from his plate. It wasn't just another café. It felt like a place where lonely people forgot they were lonely. A few minutes later the waitress returned carrying a heavy cast-iron skillet. Fresh cornbread rested inside, its golden crust still crackling from the oven. She placed it beside a steaming bowl of stew, cut a generous slice, and stepped back. "I hope you enjoy it." The stranger thanked her and broke off a small piece. The moment it touched his tongue, everything around him disappeared. He wasn't sitting in a café anymore. He was 8 years old again, standing beside a wood-burning stove while his mother laughed because he couldn't wait for the bread to cool. She always baked in a cast-iron skillet with a tiny wildflower carved into its handle. Every Sunday she whispered the same sentence before placing it into the oven. "Never bake bread for someone's stomach. Bake it for the part of them that has forgotten kindness." No bakery had ever matched that flavor. No cook had ever even come close. After her disappearance 20 years earlier, he had crossed 3 territories, visited dozens of towns, and tasted hundreds of loaves hoping to find the recipe again. Until now. He slowly took another bite. The sweetness arrived exactly when he remembered. Then came the soft buttery finish. Finally, the faint touch of sage hidden so gently inside the batter that only someone raised on the recipe would recognize it. He lowered the bread. His hands trembled. The waitress happened to pass carrying empty plates. He looked directly at her. "Who made this cornbread?" She stopped walking. Only for a heartbeat. But he noticed. Instead of answering, she asked quietly. "Why?" "Because I've been looking for this recipe half my life." "It's just cornbread." "No." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "It isn't." She studied him carefully. "You've had it before." "I grew up with it." Silence settled between them. "I'll ask the cook." She hurried into the kitchen. The stranger waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Instead of the cook, an older man stepped into the dining room. His white beard carried flour across one side, and his hands bore the scars of decades spent lifting cast-iron pans. "I own this café," he said politely. "I hear you have questions." "I do." "About the bread?" "Yes." The owner folded his arms. "Why does it matter?" The stranger reached inside his saddlebag and removed an old cloth bundle. "I've searched for the woman who created this recipe for 20 years. He unfolded the cloth. Inside rested an aged recipe card stained with butter and flour. The owner leaned closer. His confident expression disappeared. Written across the top were faded words. "Merry Sunday cornbread." Beneath the ingredients, almost hidden by time, another sentence appeared. "Leave one slice for the stranger God sends." The owner slowly looked toward the kitchen. "Where did you get this?" "It belonged to my mother." The older man's breathing changed. Wait here. He picked up the card and disappeared into the kitchen. Inside, the waitress stood beside the oven. The owner handed her the recipe. She read only the first line before freezing. I've seen this handwriting. Where? She swallowed hard. My grandmother's journal. You never told me that. I didn't think it mattered. She hurried toward a shelf, reached behind several old cookbooks, and pulled out a worn leather journal wrapped in cloth. Opening the first page, she revealed the exact same handwriting. The owner's eyes widened. Both pages ended with the same sentence. Leave one slice for the stranger God sends. The waitress looked up. This can't be coincidence. The owner nodded slowly. I don't think it is. She stared toward the dining room. The man waiting outside may have known the woman who wrote this. The waitress took a deep breath before walking back outside. The stranger stood as she approached. Instead of speaking immediately, she placed the journal beside his recipe card. He looked at the handwriting. Then at her. Where did you get this? It belonged to the woman who raised me. Your mother? No. My grandmother. Her name? Evelyn Harper. The stranger closed his eyes. He remembered. Years earlier, his mother often spoke about a dear friend named Evelyn who could turn the simplest meal into a feast. Evelyn. He whispered. She baked with my mother. The waitress frowned. You knew her? I never met her. But my mother talked about her constantly. She slowly sat across from him. I never knew where Grandma learned this recipe. The stranger carefully opened the journal. Most pages contained ordinary recipes. Bread. Stew. Biscuits. Jam. Then something unusual caught his attention. Every few pages a small wildflower had been drawn in the corner. Exactly like the carving on his mother's skillet. He turned another page. A folded letter slipped onto the table. The paper had never been opened. Across the front someone had written only 4 words. For Daniel. Alone. The stranger stared at it. My name. His voice faltered. Is Daniel. The waitress looked at the unopened letter. Grandma never mentioned anyone named Daniel. His fingers shook as he carefully broke the old wax seal. Inside rested a single sheet. He began reading silently. Halfway through. The color drained from his face. What is it? He couldn't answer. Instead, he handed her the letter. Her eyes moved across the page. Daniel, if this letter ever reaches you, it means Mary trusted Evelyn, and Evelyn trusted you. Do not search for Mary's grave because you will never find one. She did not die the day everyone believed. She disappeared because someone powerful learned what she witnessed. She left behind the only proof hidden where no thief would ever think to look, inside the recipe itself. The person who still bakes it exactly as Mary did is the only one who can reveal the truth. The waitress looked up, confused. Inside, the recipe. Before either of them could say another word, a loud crash echoed outside. A frightened horse burst free from its hitching post. A rider galloped into town at full speed. He pulled his horse to a stop in front of the café, jumped down, and rushed inside carrying yesterday's newspaper. His face was pale. They've started tearing down the old Harper farmhouse. The waitress shot to her feet. What? The demolition crew arrived this morning. The café owner's expression turned to horror. No. The rider nodded desperately. They found a hidden cellar beneath the kitchen floor. Daniel and the waitress looked at each other. For 20 years. The truth had been buried beneath the very place where the recipe had first been written. Daniel snatched his hat from the table before anyone else could move. The waitress was already untying her apron, her hands trembling so badly she struggled with the knot. The café owner locked the front door and called to the customers, anyone who wants the truth about what happened 20 years ago should come with us. No one laughed. No one questioned him. Within moments, half the town was following them toward the abandoned Harper farmhouse, a place children had been warned never to enter. For years people believed it was haunted, but the old owner had never encouraged those rumors nor denied them. Now everyone wondered if the ghost stories had been invented to keep curious eyes away. As they reached the hill overlooking the property, the sound of axes and hammers echoed through the air. A demolition crew had already torn away part of the porch, and 2 men were prying up the kitchen floor. Daniel's heart pounded. If the letter was telling the truth, whatever his mother had hidden beneath that house could disappear forever within minutes. "Stop," he shouted. The workers looked up in confusion. The foreman frowned. "Who are you?" Daniel ignored the question. "Who ordered this house destroyed?" "A businessman from the capital. Said he bought the land last month." "What was his name?" The foreman hesitated before answering. "Victor Langford Jr." The cafe owner closed his eyes. "So he came back." The waitress looked at him. "Back? He's the son of the man everyone thought died years ago. Looks like the father never truly lost. He simply waited for everyone who remembered to grow old." Daniel stepped into the ruined kitchen. Broken floorboards lay scattered everywhere, but one corner remained untouched. He noticed something strange immediately. Every plank in the room had rotted except 6 boards arranged in a perfect square. Someone had replaced them years after the house was abandoned. He knelt and brushed away the dust. Tiny wildflowers had been carved into each corner. The same symbol. Without another word he pulled out his hunting knife and began lifting the boards. The foreman stepped forward. "You can't damage private property." The waitress faced him with surprising courage. "If you're right, you'll lose a floor." "And if we're right?" She looked directly into his eyes. "You've been destroying evidence." The workers exchanged uneasy glances. No one stopped Daniel. After several minutes the final board came free. Beneath it lay an iron trapdoor hidden so perfectly that it had escaped notice for 2 decades. The cafe owner whispered, "Dear Lord." Daniel grabbed the rusted ring and pulled. At first it refused to move. Then, with a deep groan, it slowly opened. Cold air rushed upward from the darkness below. A narrow staircase disappeared into the earth. The waitress lit an old lantern. "I'm coming with you." Daniel shook his head. "It could be dangerous. So is living your whole life without the truth." He couldn't argue. Together they descended into the cellar while the townspeople waited above in complete silence. The underground room was larger than anyone expected. Shelves lined the walls, covered in dusty jars, old tools, and farming equipment. At first it looked ordinary. Then Daniel noticed the table. Everything else was buried beneath years of dust. The table wasn't. Someone had wiped it clean. Recently. He slowly approached. Resting in the center was a wooden recipe box. The waitress froze. "My grandmother had one exactly like this." Daniel carefully opened the lid. Inside were recipe cards tied together with blue ribbon. But beneath them rested something far more important. A leather ledger. Several folded letters. And a sheriff's badge stained with dried blood. Daniel opened the ledger. Page after page listed names, dates, payments, and land purchases. Every illegal deal Victor Langford had made before the flood. Every family forced from their home. Every bribe paid to silence witnesses. The cafe owner looked over his shoulder. This could destroy everything his family built. The waitress unfolded one of the letters. It was addressed to Sheriff Thomas Reed. She began reading aloud. "If you're holding this letter, I may already be dead. Victor Langford intends to destroy the river barrier on Saturday night. He believes the flood will wash away the evidence and force every remaining family to abandon their land. If anything happens to me, protect the children first. Property can be replaced. Lives cannot." Daniel's throat tightened. His mother hadn't disappeared by accident. She had uncovered murder before it happened. The waitress reached for another envelope. This one carried only a single word. Grace. Her own name. With trembling fingers she opened it. Inside was a letter written in the same familiar handwriting. "My sweet Grace, if you are old enough to read this, then you survived. Never believe you were abandoned. Your parents loved you more than life itself. They asked me to take you before the killers arrived because they knew they would never escape. I promised I would protect you, even if it meant my own son grew up believing I had left him. One day Daniel will come looking for me. When he does, tell him I kept both promises." The lantern slipped from Grace's hand and rolled across the stone floor. She covered her face as tears finally broke free. "All these years." Daniel gently picked up the letter. "My mother chose to save you." Grace nodded through her tears. "And she lost her own family because of it." Neither of them spoke for several moments. The silence was broken by heavy footsteps above. Someone was running. Then came a shout. "Daniel!" The cafe owner's voice echoed down the staircase. "You need to come up here." Daniel grabbed the ledger, the letters, and the recipe box before racing upstairs with Grace beside him. The moment they stepped outside, they saw 3 elegant black carriages stopped beside the farmhouse. Well-dressed men climbed down, dressed more like businessmen than ranchers. The man in front smiled without warmth. "You've been looking for something that belongs to my family." Daniel recognized the face immediately. Not because he'd met him before. Because the man looked exactly like the portrait drawn years earlier in the sheriff's files. Victor Langford's son. Victor Langford Jr. His smile widened as his eyes settled on the old recipe box in Daniel's hands. "I was hoping you'd find it for me." Daniel tightened his grip on the old recipe box as Victor Langford Jr. slowly climbed the porch steps. Behind him stood 6 armed men, dressed like hired guards rather than honest ranch hands. None of them reached for their weapons immediately. They didn't have to. Their confidence came from believing they had already won. Victor smiled as if greeting an old friend. "My father spent 20 years making sure that box never surfaced." Daniel's eyes never left him. "And yet here it is." Victor chuckled. "Thanks to you." Grace stepped beside Daniel, refusing to hide behind him. "You murdered my parents." Victor looked at her with cold amusement. "No, your parents murdered themselves the moment they decided my father should answer to the law." The crowd behind Daniel erupted in angry whispers. The cafe owner stepped forward. "We all remember the flood." Victor laughed. "No, you remember the story my father allowed you to remember." He slowly removed a folded document from his coat. "I legally own this property." Daniel answered calmly. "You may own the land." He lifted the leather ledger. "But you don't own the truth." For the first time Victor's smile faded. "You opened it." Daniel nodded. "Every payment. Every stolen ranch. Every bribe. Every witness your father silenced. It's all written here." Victor glanced at his men. "Take it." The guards rushed forward. Before they reached the porch, half the ranchers from town stepped between them and Daniel. Old enemies stood shoulder to shoulder. The blacksmith. The schoolteacher. The preacher. Widows whose husbands had disappeared during the flood. Young cowboys who had grown up hearing whispers instead of facts. For the first time in 20 years, the town stood together. Victor's men hesitated. They hadn't expected an entire community. Victor's expression hardened. "One ledger proves nothing." Daniel smiled slightly. "You're right." He opened the recipe box. "It doesn't." He carefully removed the final envelope hidden beneath the false wooden bottom. Everyone watched silently. Across the front were 5 simple words. "Open only before a judge." Victor suddenly lost every trace of confidence. "No." Daniel looked at him. "You knew about this." Victor took one nervous step backward. "My father searched for that letter for years." Daniel broke the seal. Inside rested a notarized confession signed by Sheriff Thomas Reed. The sheriff had written everything before his murder. How Victor Langford paid him to ignore threats against local ranchers. How Mary secretly gathered copies of every illegal deed. How Samuel Carter refused to surrender the evidence. How the river barrier had been weakened before the storm. And finally, one sentence that changed everything. Mary Harper survived the flood. She delivered these records into my care before leaving town with the Carter child. If I am found dead, arrest Victor Langford immediately. Silence swallowed the hillside. The cafe owner whispered. Mary wasn't running away. Daniel slowly folded the letter. She was protecting Grace until someone honest could finish what she started. Grace covered her mouth as tears rolled down her cheeks. My whole life. She looked toward the ruined farmhouse. She was keeping her promise. Victor suddenly shouted. Burn it. One of his men pulled a torch from the wagon. Before he could take another step, the town blacksmith knocked the torch into the dirt. Another rancher tackled the guard. Within seconds the hired men were surrounded by dozens of townspeople. Realizing he had lost control, Victor spun toward his carriage. Daniel didn't chase him. Instead he calmly spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. You can outrun one man. Victor reached his horse. But you can't outrun the truth. Before Victor could mount, riders appeared on the distant road. County deputies. The young rider who had warned them earlier had secretly ridden to the county seat the moment Daniel entered the cellar. The sheriff dismounted and accepted the ledger, the letters, and the confession. He read only the first page before looking directly at Victor. Victor Langford Jr., you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, destruction of evidence, and the murders your family tried to bury. Victor's shoulders collapsed. 20 years of lies ended in a single afternoon. Months later, the Harper farmhouse had been rebuilt. Not as a home. As a museum honoring every family lost during the flood. Inside the old kitchen, beneath a glass case, rested the recipe card that had changed everything. Visitors often expected to find a secret ingredient written somewhere on the page. There wasn't one. Only ordinary ingredients. Cornmeal. Butter. Eggs. Milk. Salt. Nothing unusual. Children would always ask. If that's the recipe, why doesn't everyone's cornbread taste the same? Grace would smile every time. Because the secret was never written down. Daniel had finally stopped traveling. He restored the little café with the owner, who eventually retired and handed the business to Grace. The sign above the entrance changed. It no longer carried the owner's name. It simply read, Mary's Table. Every evening, just before closing, Grace baked one fresh skillet of cornbread. She always placed a single untouched slice beside the window. One evening Daniel asked, You still leave the last piece? She nodded. My grandmother never stopped believing someone in need would walk through that door. Daniel smiled. My mother believed the same thing. Grace handed him a warm slice. Do you know what I finally realized? What? The stranger she was talking about. She looked around the crowded café. Was never just one person. Daniel looked across the room. A lonely traveler sharing supper with a widow. Two brothers laughing after years of bitterness. A little girl eating her first hot meal in days. An elderly veteran quietly wiping tears as the smell of fresh bread reminded him of home. Grace continued softly. Sometimes people arrive hungry. She placed another skillet into the oven. Sometimes they arrive carrying grief. The warm smell of cornbread slowly filled the café. And sometimes. She looked at the old recipe card hanging on the wall. They arrive searching for someone they've already lost. Daniel smiled. I came looking for the woman who made the cornbread. Grace gently shook her head. No. He looked at her curiously. You came looking for hope. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The oven timer rang. Grace removed the perfectly golden cornbread and cut it into generous slices. Before serving anyone else, she quietly placed one piece on a small wooden plate beside the window. Just as Mary had done. Just as Evelyn had done. Just as kindness had survived every lie, every flood, and every passing year. Outside, another dusty traveler stopped in front of the café, drawn by the irresistible aroma drifting into the street. He hesitated before opening the door. Grace smiled as the bell rang above the entrance. Without asking his name. Without asking if he could pay. She picked up the waiting slice of cornbread and placed it gently in front of him. Because she had finally understood the lesson that one brave woman had hidden inside a simple recipe more than 20 years earlier. The greatest family is not always the one you're born into. Sometimes it's the one that chooses to save a stranger, and never asks for anything in return. If this story touched your heart or taught you something valuable, don't keep it to yourself, share it with your friends and family so they can experience it too. Thumbs up if you enjoyed the story, please leave a like. Speech balloon, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what was your favorite moment in today's story?